Hello, and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants.
Just not always the same ones.
I'm Steve Aiken from Fine Gardening Magazine.
I'm Danielle Sherry from Fine Gardening Magazine. It's always like you think that I should say who I am in that other part. Like there's always a pause. And I'm not sure if our brilliant audio engineer, Carrie, always takes that pause out, but we need to, it's you. I'll point to you next time and then you'll know. Like, there you go, Steve.
What?
You'll know, like, you have to say who you are. Like, that's your cue. I'll be like,
didn't I just say, I just said who I was.
After an awkward silence, dead airspace. Well, hello, loyal listeners.
Sorry, I thought I nailed it, but yeah, okay. It's going to be one of those shows. It's going to be one of those shows.
Well, no, it's going to be a great show and a very timely show because we're going to talk about drought-tolerant plants today. It seems like there's very few places within the continental United States right now that aren't experiencing a drought. We are experiencing a drought on the East Coast. The Midwest is pretty dry. The West Coast, from what I hear, is on fire. And then also they're about to get 100-degree weather out in Seattle, of all places. So this is a very strange, droughty year thus far.
Well, I think we should have a disclaimer that the plants we're going to talk about are not the ones that would live through what the West Coast is going through, where like it hasn't rained in years, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's not, some of these plants might make it, but that has not been, I've never experienced that. So I can't really talk about that. But to me, these are plants that have gone through, we had a mild, but decent drought last summer.
We did.
These plants sailed through, and I've really never had any trouble with them, and I've never watered them. And really, drought is kind of the norm these days. Even, in normal years, people from Seattle will tell you it does not rain in June, July, and August.
Yeah.
That's a drought. You go 3 months without rain. That's a drought. You need plants that can survive without that.
Yeah.
And not wilt. And really anything that says, like, oh, it needs moist soil or consistently moist soil, I just stay away from, just because I'm not a good waterer. I'm not a good waterer, and I know rain is spotty. So, they're gonna have to be able to live on their own. So that's what I've got here.
And I'm always dealing with, my conditions are full sun, sharply drained, lean soil. So regardless, even if I'm getting a rainy year, I don't have moist soil, and as much as I amend, I don't have moisture retentive soil. I'm never going to have moisture retentive soil. So I've always had to rely upon a lot of plants that are considered drought tolerant, because that's the only thing, especially in the worst sections of my garden, that'll actually make it, which is surprising me right now that I don't think I have a single shrub on my list, but that a lot of the reason that I have a lot of shrubs in my landscape is because they, once established, they tend to be a little bit hardier as far as drought is concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I almost don't think of shrubs in terms of drought tolerance because it didn't occur to me. They'll kind of sail through. They're pretty tough. They have deep, resilient root systems. At least the ones that I grow, because again, like I don't grow things that require consistently moist soil because they ain't getting it.
Yeah.
But I went for mostly perennials, and ironically enough, pretty much things that are all blooming at this time. Because basically I walked around the garden yesterday and said, like, okay, what can I do? I'm like, oh, that looks nice. I'll do that one.
I did the same thing because I have so many to choose from. And then, also a disclaimer that, we talked at the top of the show off air that we were talking about. We have tons of plants that we've already spoken about where they're workhorse plants or they're, the best perennial grasses. We've talked about a lot of drought tolerant plants that we're not going to mention here because we've talked about them so much in other episodes leading up to this. So, go back to some of our other episodes and we've called out, especially in the grasses, episode that we did, the workhorse episode we did, we've got drought tolerant plants that we mentioned in there as well.
Yeah. It would be easier for me to list the plants in my garden that are not drought tolerant. Yeah.
That should be our next topic. Pain in the butt plants.
I could list plants that are not drought tolerant, but still survive anyway. But like I have, buckets full of plant tags of plants that just didn't, probably needed more water for me. And, living in the East Coast, we have the unique situation where rain is spotty in the summer. So plants need to be able to take it dry. But then in the winter, it's a pretty steady moisture with the snow cover. And that's where a lot of Western plants for us fail is in the winter moisture issue. It's not a cold temperature thing because it gets really cold in the mountains in the West, but it's a dry cold.
Yeah.
But it's the cold and the wet that kills them out here in the East. So we need plants that, that can tolerate kind of both.
Yeah. I actually have 2 Western plants that of all these ones that I have tried that have actually done okay and survived despite the winter wet issue. And I think it's because of location, but I'll get into that later.
Well, we just did an article on that. Readers of Fine Gardening magazine will have been treated to an article we did, Best of the West for the rest of us, where it's these Western plants that can take the conditions of the rest of the country, like the cold or the wet or the humidity, and still make it out here. And I've got a couple. I'm growing one. Is Canna Creek buckwheat on your list?
Yeah. No, okay. Well, no, it's not on my list, but yes, it is one that I love. I know that you grow. I was worried that you were going to talk about it, so I didn't. But yeah, that's a great plant. That's one that did. And, we even mentioned some penstemons before. I mean, those are drought tolerant. You didn't have any penstemons on your list, did you?
No, but I killed a lot of Western penstemons. They made it through. Some didn't make it through one winter. Some made it through a couple, then petered out, and then 3 or 4. The ones that survived for me are either East Coast natives or from the prairie.
Yeah. In that similar vein.
But the Western, the Rocky Mountain, Colorado ones haven't done well for me. Maybe they require a little care or attention, to get established, which I don't provide. So.
Well, let's stop talking about all the plants we're not going to talk about, and let's start talking about the plants we are. So what do you got first?
Well, I told you before you did your list that it would be cheating if you put a succulent on there because succulents are drought-tolerant plants. and I said that after I already listed a sedum on mine. Now, sedums are pretty noteworthy for being drought-tolerant plants. And they're great because they can handle drought tolerance. They can handle, most of them can handle, winter moisture, and seem to do just fine. There's one that I'm growing now that's a little different from my other sedums. It's called Little Miss Sunshine sedum. And it's really just this little tight green mound of glossy green foliage. Now, normally, you have your upright sedums, and then you have your low kind of, loose, kind of scraggly ones. This one forms like a nice, compact little mound.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, it's just sitting there, and it's just being a mound. It's not really stretching out. It might slowly creep to get a little bigger, but it's always going to be in this nice, tight little mound. And to me, that's somewhat unusual for a sedum because even the ones that do mound, they kind of spread out and they get kind of bare in the center. This one's not. It's a nice, tight little mound. It's just this little mound of green. It looks awesome. And then, early summer, June, it gets covered in these in yellow flowers. It has like these little round discs of little yellow flowers. And so now I have these little puff balls of yellow flowers, in my garden. And it's one of those plants that just always looks good.
Yeah.
Because it's this nice, tidy little mound. It only gets to be about 8 inches tall, maybe. It's supposed to spread up to like over a foot and a half. Mine are probably just under a foot right now. Zones 3 to 9. Full sun I have it in. I'm sure it can take partial shade. Well-drained soil. But other than that, it has asked nothing of me. And it's one of those plants. It's in the worst part of my yard. And I chucked it down there a couple years ago. And there she is, Little Miss Sunshine, shining away. I took 57 pictures of her, this year because she's looking so good. And again, totally drought tolerant, roadside. It would be my equivalent of a hell strip plant.
Yeah.
Just super, 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 super dry and sunny in the summer. And then, salty and wet in the winter. And it can handle it. It's doing great. Little Miss Sunshine sedum.
We featured that in a new plants section that we did a couple years ago. I mean, that's relatively new to the market. And I have the variegated version of that came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago called Boogie Woogie.
I think I have one of those. How's yours doing?
So good. And it is in the worst part of my garden, the absolute worst. Radiant heat from the parking areas, along a stone wall, dry, full sun, really well. I will say it hasn't spread all that much. I mean, I would say that it's basically the size of a 2-gallon perennial, which I think is basically the size that I planted to begin with. It's this little tuft of variegated foliage, gets those same yellow discs. I love in spring because it emerges with like this neon pink and white and green. And then the pink eventually goes away and it goes to all green and white splashy foliage, but the same habit, same look, same flowers that you were talking about, just variegated. And that's Boogie Woogie.
Yeah. See, I know when I was planting that, I know that there's a variegated one down there because I can remember I had trouble like where am I going to stick this one variegated one? It just looks weird. But I didn't notice it when I was down there. And it might be because Little Miss Sunshine looks so good right now. It might be because it's not there anymore. It might be because it's behind another plant and I just didn't see it, because I wasn't looking for it. I was just so entranced by Little Miss Sunshine, who's looking so good.
I think I just am gonna, because now one of the plants that's next to my Boogie Woogie sedum is the next plant that I'm going to talk about. And I wasn't going to talk about this one, but let's just do it because I'm in that section in my head of my garden. And it's the most controversial plant on my list. So let's just get it out of the way. And, nasty letters, come on, I'll take them, send them my way. But I wanted to talk about donkey tail spurge, which is euphorbia. Stop making that face. Euphorbia mercenites, zones 5 to 9. Now, all right, we're going to do a little disclaimer. If you live in the Midwest and the East, great. This is a great plant. I live in the East. I'm going to talk about it. I love this plant and it's super drought tolerant. If you live in the West, it's aggressive and it is not a plant for you. Don't plant it. It's not going to be your friend. You definitely need to live in an area where the winter keeps this guy in check. So if you live in the East or the Midwest, this is an awesome plant. It is 8 to 12 inches tall and wide. It has these long kind of, these branching structures that are a really, really glaucous blue color with these needle-like blue-green leaves all around each one of the branches of the plant. It kind of looks like, like an underwater sea creature growing along the edges. And it's absolutely beautiful in spring. And we're talking early spring. Here in the East, usually around March, it gets these yellow umbel flowers. I absolutely love it because it's one of the first things other than bulbs to bloom in my garden, and the pollinators go bananas over it. They just seem so happy. They're like, oh my God, thank God, something other than a daffodil that I can land on, which is really awesome. And I love to see them just all buzzing around it. Then you cut off the flowers kind of go by and you can let them go to seed, but this guy does self-sow. Not obnoxiously, but it does self-sow almost like tall verbena self-sows in this area. You will get little serendipitous patches of this plant throughout your beds. It kind of makes me look like a good designer because it gives me some continuity throughout all of my beds. Like, oh, look at that. She continued that glaucous blue color. No, I planted 3 plants and now I've got, a dozen or more in these different areas. But it takes the worst conditions, dry soil, lean, in an area of the garden that I've done a really bad job amending and is basically the backfill from when our foundation was dug. It is growing in that soil where nothing else other than a couple of creeping sedums are growing. It's really, really tough. I already said zones 5 to 9. I think it actually, I have seen it growing in a zone 4 garden, but I'm not sure if it's reliably going to come back in a zone 4 garden. But yeah, that's donkey tail spurge. It's a euphorbia, which I technically don't think makes it a succulent, but maybe it does. The one thing I will say, as is with all euphorbias, when you prune them, cut them, deadhead them, they produce this milky sap that can irritate your skin. So just be careful about that. The great thing about euphorbias is because they produce that milky white sap, voles leave them alone entirely. So in my garden where everything is subjected to voles, they tend to leave this guy alone. So that's donkey tail spurge. Don't plant it if you live in the West.
So the good thing about that plant is the way it reseeds into little nooks and crannies.
Mm-hmm.
And it has enough personality so that when it starts to grow in these nooks and crannies, it looks like you took the time to actually plant, like you were down to that level of detail when it kind of just happened on its own. And yet it looks kind of natural. So people can read it either way. Either way, you win. And then for gardeners in the West, there are pictures of this euphorbia. There will be pictures of this euphorbia and pictures of Danielle on our website that if you want to put them on your dartboard and throw them, because the plant is a problem out West. Like it reseeds. It's a weed.
It is.
And like you said, like we have the winter to keep it in check.
Yeah.
And so we can kind of grow it out here, but anywhere, west of Ohio, I'd start watching out for it. But other than that, it's a great plant. So it's interesting. You brought up a plant that you weren't going to bring up, and you brought up a self-sower, because I'm going to bring up a plant that I wasn't going to bring up, but kind of wanted to, and is a self-sower. But in terms of drought tolerance, California poppies are just amazing. And they're annuals, so I don't know if they count or not. But I've always loved California poppies. They're a little too orange for me. So the straight species, Schultzia californica, is a wonderful sort of yellowy orange, much more orange than yellow, but it's not like a garish red orange. But that's a little too much for me. So I found a cultivar that has sort of creamy yellow flowers, and I can't find the exact cultivar name. I think it's Alba. So Schultzia California Alba. And I had some seeds of it, and I don't know how this happened, but I threw them into a neglected container that sits in full sun. Like, I don't know why I did this. I think like I sprinkled them somewhere to grow. And then like I had some left. I'm like, oh, I'll toss them in this container, see what happens. And then months later, I went by this container, which sits in full sun, does not get watered at all. And they're growing like gangbusters, and this is like July, during a dry July, and they're growing just fine. No supplemental water. They're not able to reach out into the ground for water. They're growing in a container, and they did great. I'm like, oh, isn't that nice? I should probably take care of them. And then didn't take care of them for the rest of the year. And then they reseeded around. So actually, the picture that will be on the website, you'll actually see the container in the background. And this was I sprinkled them in the container 3 years ago. So this is 2 years, and they're still. It's not like they're everywhere. I got like 3 or 4 around every year, and they're great. And this year I started sprinkling them down by my roadside, which is the worst, part of my. And they popped up, and they're doing great. So if you don't know California poppies, they have this very grayish green, finely cut foliage, kind of meandering, low down, scrambling spreader with these they're like pale butter yellow cups, that they hold up. And it's not yellow enough to be yellow. It's not white enough to be white. It's somewhere in between those two.
So is it white with like a yellow center, which just makes it look like it's kind of all yellow?
No. It's like if you had a piece of yellow construction paper and you left it in the back of the car, behind the back seat, and it started to fade. That's what it looks like.
Perfect.
They look really delicate. They're like poppies. They have like that crepe paper kind of tiny flower that looks delicate, but they're super tough. Like I said, I have given these things zero care, and they're doing just fine. Native to West Coast, obviously, with the species named Californica, and because they're annuals, they don't have to survive the winter moisture because they're dormant seeds at that point, and they seem to not mind it. They get to be about a foot tall. And maybe like a foot wide because they kind of spread out and scramble. Full sun. I've only grown them in terrible soil. so I don't know what they can take. But in terms of drought tolerance, especially for annuals, when I think of annuals, I think they need a lot of water, they need a lot of fertilizer, and I don't do anything for my California poppies other than try to throw them down at the right time. One mistake I made is to sow your seeds over my chopped leaf mulch.
Oh yeah.
So the seeds never make contact with soil, or then I clean up the leaves, and then they have to actually be in contact with the soil. Yeah, but geez, California poppies, a drought tolerant annual, which sounds like an oxymoron, right? I mean, name another drought tolerant annual. There's not a lot of no fuss annuals.
Yeah,
actually, there are a ton of no fuss annuals. And they're called weeds.
Yeah.
Yes. But this one is not a weed, and it's attractive, and it will not be a problem. I live in Connecticut, and it reseeds for me, not quite like your euphorbia or Verbena bonariensis, but reliable enough. Again, like I said, 3 years ago, I threw some seeds in a pot of an annual, and I still have this plant in basically the same area because it reseeded around. And
it sounds like it does have like a similar, habit and jam as tall Verbena bonariensis. It's like
Verbena bonariensis is very tall. This is short.
No. I meant not like habit. I meant like it's like how it behaves. Its behavioral, jam is much the same. The same. I'm going with a yellow cup-like flower too. So I'm going to go with Oenothera fremontii shimmer. And this is an evening primrose. This is a beautiful silver ferny leaf foliage evening primrose, which is really different and not your typical evening primrose, with beautiful yellow cup-like flowers to it. This was a plant that I brought back from Colorado. It's a plant that was discovered in Lauren Springer, who is an amazing garden designer and horticultural guru out in Colorado. She discovered it in her garden, and shimmer is the perfect cultivar name. I'm so glad that, she didn't go with some obscure name that doesn't, all these cultivar names, sometimes you're like, what the heck is this? But shimmer is perfect because it really is almost as silvery as an Artemisia as far as its foliage is concerned. So I brought this plant back from Colorado. It was about a 2-inch plant. I packed it up, threw it in my suitcase, and I did not have high hopes because it needs dry winters. It needs well-drained soil. For the most part, evening primroses as a group, Oenothera is pretty drought tolerant across the entire genus. But this particular one, because it's a Western native, zones 4 to 8, I was skeptical. I planted it and I didn't know, I did it a big disservice. I've moved it probably 4 times. So it's not huge. It's not huge, but I kept moving it to get it into, I planted it and then it got crowded out by, some thuggish shrubs that are near it. So then I pulled it out again and then I replanted it again. And so, I did not do a good job with it, but it has persevered. And I will say it is on a bit of a slope. So it doesn't really, even when we get hard winters and such, it's the first place to kind of melt and drain off. So I think that has really helped me here on the East Coast with this Western native plant. But eventually, if you stop moving it every year, it gets to be about 8 inches tall and about 15 inches wide. But the foliage alone on this is just so striking and so beautiful. Mine isn't blooming right now. It usually starts in early summer, late spring to early summer, puts on a good show of flowers, then stops, then sporadically blooms throughout the summer and into fall and until frost with spotty blooms here and there. So, it has an extended show. If this plant never bloomed, I'd be okay with it because it's just that strikingly, texturally interesting and just so, so beautiful. It's just, it's one of those plants you just want to touch. So again, that's shimmer, evening primrose. That's Oenothera fremontii shimmer, and well-drained soil. Try not to get it into winter wet, but super, uber drought tolerant, like most of the evening primrose family.
I wish I had a nickel for every time I looked at a plant and said, "Oh, you're doing so great there. Let me move you." I even have a term for it. Instead of forced repatriation, I call it forced replantation. Because everything was going fine. I'm okay here. Why are you going, no? And then you move it somewhere else. And then.
I have messed with that poor plant so many times. I mean, I've probably had it 4 or 5 years and it's probably been moved 4 or 5 times. And I just need to knock it off. This year is its best looking year because I actually didn't move it last year. So I think it would be doing a whole lot better if I had just stopped messing with it.
There are members of that genus that are native, I think, all over North America. They're East Coast natives. And I think they're all spreaders, too. Like, that's my impression of them. Like, you give it some room to spread.
Yes. They do bulk out. Some a little more, I don't want to say aggressively, some a little more nicely than others. But this one stays relatively, I saw full-sized versions of shimmer when I was out in Colorado, I think at the Botanic Garden out there. And, it was nice, 15 inches wide. It was staying pretty well behaved.
Well, and if it gets too big, you can always divide it and give it to someone.
True.
Well, one plant that I'm not sure how to divide, and I've only lately become successful in growing anyway, is blue fescue. You know blue fescue, Danielle? It's just these little blue puff balls of grass. Yeah. And they really are like a really glaucous blue. And Festuca glauca is their Latin name. Zones 3 to 9, zones 4 to 9. They kind of go all over the place. And fans of the original Star Trek will know what a tribble is. They kind of look like tribbles. Or they look like the top head of a troll doll. Because they kind of go up in that.
Or blue sea urchin.
Blue sea urchins, okay. And so the one that I grow is called blue fox, and its cultivar name is in German, which is Blaufuchs, which now that I say it, I kind of like better. But anyway,
me too.
It's also not. It doesn't seem to be that available anymore. The most common variety is Elijah Blue, and then there's Beyond Blue.
I don't think Elijah Blue is a good plant. I will say it up front.
We'll get to. Your turn to speak will come, my dear. So
this is an interactive conversation, Steve, but go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
So, blue fox, in fact, I've killed Elijah Blue, and I don't know if it's Elijah Blue's fault or mine. It could be mine, but I've succeeded with blue fox, which, like I said, it seems to be available at local markets, but I can't find it available mail order online. Beyond Blue is another one that's supposed to be good. They get to be about 6 to 8 inches tall and wide, full sun, average to dry soil. And like I said, it's like a little blue tuffet. And in late spring, early summer, it sends up these tawny arrows that are the inflorescences, and it looks like it's holding aloft all these spears, and it's it would be like trundling into battle of some sort. And it looks really cool. It has a very Western look to it. There are some species that are native to the West Coast. But it's just done so great for me in my hot, dry, neglected area. It's resisted being crowded out by other things that I did not pull out of there. It's just doing really well. Where Elijah Blue kind of failed on me. And now that I think about it, I might have Beyond Blue somewhere else. I just remember that I planted some more blue fescue in another spot, and they're doing great too. And it's just they look right in a dry area. For some reason, it's that glaucous blue grassy foliage. They just look right and natural in a drier area. It supposedly doesn't like humidity. And we have humidity here, not like Georgia. But, it did seem like Elijah Blue kind of melted out. And these I have not had that issue with. I don't know how to divide them because they are just this round ball. I feel guilty chopping them in half. And then you have like a semicircle. And it just seems like I've amputated something, and it just doesn't look right. I'm sure it would recover. So that's a downside to it. And the other downside to it is getting rid of the old foliage. Like you can't just. I suppose you could shear it back, but you've got some dead foliage in amongst with the living foliage, and it's hard. And so what I know we've had some authors and experts recommend, I've seen other people do this too, is you just put on some gloves and kind of just comb it out with your hands.
Yeah. Rubber gloves, they stick. Yeah.
And I've done that. And oh my God, you do it and you get like 2 or 3 strands. Like, this is going to take forever. This is never going to work. But you keep at it for a few minutes and you realize wow, I got most of that out and that wasn't that hard. So those are kind of the only downsides to it. And one of the reasons why it sticks out for me as a notable plant is because I'm surprised that it succeeded. Because Elijah Blue failed so spectacular, and because I give it absolutely no care whatsoever. But after it's got to be like 5 or 6 years of neglect, they're starting to look really good. Maybe that's the key. Just leave them alone. I'm not going to touch them. I'm just going to let them go. So go on your Elijah Blue spiel.
Well, no, so I was just going to say, when Elijah Blue first hit the market, I'm going to say like it started growing hugely in popularity mid 90s. And I was working in nurseries, and every landscaper on the face of the planet would come and order usually 100 Stelladora daylilies and 100 Elijah Blue fescues. And that would be what you would see in every single landscape garden, front yard, Stop and Shop parking lot from here to Maine. And it just really, it bummed me out because it was that plant, throwing a little red mulch and there you go. That was what New England looked like basically
that's perfect. So you've got red, blue, and yellow. Those are the three primary colors. You've got your rainbow going there.
Well, right. And to Stelladora daylilies defense, that always looks good. It looks great. I mean, there's a reason that it always, was on the top of the landscapers list. But Elijah Blue, and I came to think that it was because of the humidity that we do get in this area, and especially because I live coastally and, you get a lot of coastal humidity, that they would brown out, they would rot out, they would get some sort of rust-like looking disease. Now, that's based on zero knowledge that I have of plant pathology, but it looked like it suffered from some sort of rust disease, and these things looked horrible. But they'd never be replaced because they'd have like a couple of like blue tufts that were still hanging on these plants. And it totally turned me off to the plant. Now that's sad because the thing that they've been doing is improving. This is what plant breeders do, right? So they improve upon it. They get something like Blue Fox that's going on. I know that Brent Horvath in the Midwest has done a lot of work with festucas too that are, that resist the rust diseases and the issues along those lines. So, but I can't, do you have those plants that like you had a negative experience with in some way, shape or form and you just can't get over it?
Yeah, but I think, you've had a bad experience with it. I've had a bad experience with it. That might be an accurate reaction to this plant. It might not be that good. And that happens a lot. And I can remember, a big plant guru back when I was just starting to know about plants, talking about this one really popular plant that she said was terrible. I'm like, oh yeah, I killed that. And it was so refreshing to know that it wasn't me.
Right.
Who did this, and I just couldn't grow this plant. Like, no, that's a really popular plant. It's not very good.
Yeah.
And that happens. It happens from time to time where, they get trialed and they seem like they're good, but then once they get out into the marketplace, you realize, maybe they're not that great or they have issues. And so that's the good thing about breeding, where they come along with one that's better. The breeding I don't like is where they one that's not necessarily better or changes in such a way that I can't notice a difference. I didn't notice any problems with this one, but now I can't get the old one because you have this new one, which I don't like as much.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. So true. Well, listen, so I was just mentioning Brent Horvath. And so, amazing perennial plant breeder, owner of Intrinsic Perennials out in the Midwest. But he does a lot of work with grasses and breeding of grasses and new superior versions of grasses. So I know I've mentioned this plant before, but I'm just going to throw it in there to hop off your grass theme. And that's Blackhawk's Blue Stem and Andropogon gerardii Blackhawks. That's zones 3 to 9. This grass is my favorite grass that I've bought in probably the last 5 years. I didn't buy it, by the way. It was my favorite sample plant that I received as a grass in the last 5 years. Big blue stems, 5 feet tall, 2 feet wide. I did everything you shouldn't have done with a prized sample plant with this guy. I took the Steve approach. I left it in its pot on the side of the driveway for a full year before actually planting it in the ground. And then when I decided to plant this beautiful ornamental grass in the ground, I did it in mid-July, and then I did not water it for the entire summer until I discovered it probably the end of August, beginning of September, when we had actually gotten some rain and this thing like started rising from the dead that looked like just a tuft of like dead grass, and it rose up and there's these beautiful blue, and I go, oh my God, I almost killed Blackhawks without even trying. So in the years that followed, it has rebounded considerably. I have still given it zero care. It is still in a very, very tough, full sun, lean, well-drained soil situation, but it's doing great with these. Mine right now isn't quite, it's about 2 feet, maybe 3 feet tall, bluish glaucous blades to it. It emerges this blue-green in spring, and then as the temperatures start to cool down in September, October here in the east, it starts turning red, but then it really goes deep, dark purple, like black, and then puts on these beautiful plumes and inflorescences that are this dark burgundy color. So it's a really, really attractive grass. I think it probably would be full size if I hadn't treated it so poorly in the beginning of its poor little life. But that's a testament to, it's a tough plant. It's a drought tolerant plant. It basically will thrive no matter what you throw at it and however hard you try to kill it. And I should mention that it's named after the Blackhawks hockey team, the Chicago Blackhawks, which I think Brett would want me to mention his beloved hockey team when I mention this plant. But this is a good one. It's a good grass. A lot of ornamental grass, prairie plants, North American native are going to be drought tolerant because that's their natural environment. Full sun, well drained, not a lot of water. That's where they do their thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is they come from an area where it is drought prone, or not even drought prone. It's just dry, the American prairie. And they have these super deep root systems, so if you ever want to move it, I'm not sure if that's true of all ornamental grasses, but it seems like it. If you ever want to move it, it's just impossible because the roots go all the way, go to the, deep into the earth's mantle. You can never, truly dig it up or get rid of it or move it to a different spot. So be happy where you plant it. But I've never heard a bad thing about Blackhawks. So that's one that is definitely on my list of plants that I want to try. But because it's hard to move, I don't want to do my normal thing, which is, like I said, oh, you look great, I'm moving. But like what I normally do is, oh, well, I'll just put you here for now until I figure out the right place for you. And then things get happy and grow and get too big to move, which I'm dealing with a bunch of shrubs that are on year 3 that I didn't think were going to live. And now they're big and bulky and not where they're supposed to be. And so I'll probably kill them. Danielle, I have a moral question for you. You get to be you get to be the advice columnist or something like that. Would you ever walk into somebody's front yard to take a picture of a plant?
Oh, of course, 110%. And I've done that.
And you don't know the person. You just walk into the front yard.
I would. I would, because I have the excuse of, oh, hi, I'm an editor at Fine Gardening Magazine. Oh, I was just so, I feel like that gets you a lot of trespassers leeway when you say you're a garden magazine editor. If I was just not a garden, I don't know if I would. What's
the reaction been to your trespassing?
They're generally very lovely. Like it goes from
the police accept your excuses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have never found myself in the back of a cop car. So let's get that right. We're going to clear that up.
Have you ever had to run from barking dogs?
No.
Okay. Right.
Nor have I ever been at the business end of a double barrel shotgun for trespassing. So I guess it's all good. I wouldn't recommend it to everyone though. So have you ever?
No, and I never would, and I'm surprised that people would do this. But the other day, when I was walking from my home office, which is one side of the house, to the kitchen, I walk right by, the windows open to the front yard, and there's something in the front yard, and I turned, and there's the person standing in my front lawn. I'm like, what the? And so I start to go out there because like, what the heck? My kids live here. Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And then I notice that it's this woman taking a picture of a plant. So like, as I go out there, my whatever anger and fear, start to, okay, she's just taking a picture of a plant. Why would they? And then, so by the time I left the door, I was angry. But then by the time I got to her, I was like, okay. You're taking a picture of one of my plants.
You were filled with pride.
Like, well, like by the time I got there, I'm like, what am I going to say now that I'm halfway here? Because now I'm not angry, and it's just fine if you take the picture and go. And so, like, I walked up to her and just said hello. And
yeah, because what are you going to say? What are you doing on my yard? You're going to sound like Mr. Wilson from Dennis the Menace.
And like, can I help you? So anyway, the plant she was taking a picture of was a big blue sea holly, Eryngium zebelii big blue, zones 5 to 9, and it's a striking looking plant. It gets to be about 3 feet tall, like the basal foliage maybe 8 inches, and then it sends up maybe 2 to 3 feet tall. Flower spikes, which are a central cone surrounded by a spiky collar, which is technically a bract. Mm-hmm. And the big blue is like a true blue flower. And so this is all blue, and the stems are blue. And it's a very striking plant. It sticks up. It's almost out of place where I have it, but it's one of those plants that can't be moved. And so it's very noticeable. And this is the plant that she was taking a picture of. Very striking, very noticeable, wonderful, super cool plant, very drought tolerant. It's another one that's drought tolerant because it has a very deep, tap root or whatever, or root system, which is why it hates to be moved. But a trouble-free, drought-tolerant plant, also in my worst areas. I've never watered any of them. I have several different cultivars and probably different species, too, of Eryngium. I never give any care to any of them. They do prefer more sun to less. So full sun, maybe a little bit of shade, but not too much, because they'll lean over to wherever the sun is. Average to dry soil, and just a really carefree, drought-tolerant plant that always catches the eye and will scratch your shins if you happen to walk next to it. So don't plant it on the edge of the border like I did.
I do love Eryngium, but Miss Wilmot's Ghost is one, is I think the one that I'm most familiar with. I don't think I have any in my garden, which is shocking considering like my conditions. It would be really good. But yeah, they're so beautiful because those bracts aren't they're the flowers, quote unquote, but they're not technically flowers. But it's so great because they last so long. They basically freeze dry themselves onto the plant. So you just, it is for all intents and purposes, a plant that starts blooming and looks like it's in bloom for months and months, and hey, that works for me. That's great.
It starts blooming early summer. And then, like you said, even when the flowers are done, they still look cool.
Yeah.
Bumblebees love it, even though it's not native. I don't think I've seen other pollinators on it, but definitely bumblebees on it. So yeah, I mean, just a great drought tolerant strike. There's just nothing, there's no downside to it. Now, Miss Wilmot's Ghost is actually, I think it's a biennial.
Yeah.
That reseeds.
Yeah.
And I've always loved that one too. Instead of being blue, that one's like a ghostly, silvery white, and the bracts are a little fuller on that one. They're still spiky, but they're kind of fuller. And I just bought some seed for that. And I bought it this spring, and supposedly you're supposed to sow it in fall.
Okay. It needs that stratification.
Yeah. So it's now sitting in a packet for me to sow in fall. And I know what's going to happen is next spring is going to come around, and I'm doing my seeds. I'm going to see this packet from Miss Wilmot's, Ghost that I was supposed to do, and then I'll wait for the next fall. And this will happen repeatedly for years until, like 10 years have gone by. I'm like, I'll forget it and I'll throw the seed out.
They do make this thing called Google Calendar. You could like September 1st, you could just set yourself a little plant the sea holly, and it'll ping you. And yeah,
not familiar with it. Don't know what you're talking about. I couldn't. That sounds too complicated for me.
Okay, all right. Hey, I've got a question for you that's uncomplicated. It's just simple yes, no. Have you ever grown cistus? Rock rose?
No. I'm trying to think of a plant that I have. Its common name one of its common names is rock rose.
Yes,
but it's not cistus. Yeah.
It's not cistus. Okay. Yes, rock rose, I feel like gets attached to, like as a common name to a lot of different plants, but the cistus is like its common name is rock rose. This is, for all intents and purposes, this is a West Coast, California, Oregon sweetheart of a plant. You go out traveling out west, you see this plant in many different iterations all over the place. Super, super drought tolerant, zone 6 to 9. And unbeknownst to me, so I had a photo shoot at the end of last week. I was out in Cape Cod and I'm, wandering through this garden, which is a solid 6, but sandy, well-drained soil, full sun right on the coast. And I just became infatuated with this plant. And in my mind, I said, oh, I really think that's a cistus. It's this beautiful, 5 to 6 foot tall shrub. It's got these fuzzy green leaves and kind of reddish stems, but really these flowers were, twice the size of a golf ball, white with a yellow center, almost like a papery, camellia-like look to them with some splashes of burgundy towards them. And lo and behold, I marched myself up to the gardener at the end of the shoot and I said, is that a cistus down there? And it was. And they've been experimenting with them in this garden because of the droughty conditions and in areas where it wouldn't be subjected to as much winter wet. So this is another one of those plants that's, a Western drought tolerant plant that does really, really well. However, isn't going to do very well with winter wet. But I'm thinking, shoreline location, full sun, really well-drained, lean soil. That's me. That's me. Like I have to get some of these and start experimenting around because it was really an impressive looking plant. I actually took a little video of it, and if our web team can figure it out, we'll throw that up online in these show notes with the plant list because it was so beautiful. I don't really know what else to say about it. I think the particular cultivar, the gardener couldn't remember, but I think the particular cultivar of this one was called Alan Fradd. That's Fradd, cistus, rock rose, Alan Fradd. Starts flowering in early summer, goes all the way into frost too. So, that's pretty awesome as well. They come in bright pink, they come in yellow, they come in white, they come in every color of the rainbow. But this particular one, Alan Fradd, believe it was just really, really striking and beautiful. And I feel like it's one of those Western natives that I'm going to experiment with because I feel like my garden is just really built for that situation.
Well, I wish you luck with it. I think Cape Cod probably has more moderating temperatures, so it doesn't get as cold, as you might. But yeah, knock yourself out. I think it's a good West Coast plant that I don't think would be hardy in Connecticut, but you never know until you try. I mean, the hardiness zones are a suggestion anyway,
Zone 6 to 9, though. I'm a zone 6. I'm a zone 6. I'm going to give it a whirl, and then I'll let you laugh at me when I fail.
But no. You should laugh at me when you succeed.
Okay. Yes. That's positive thinking. Put it out into the universe.
And now, because everything sounds better with a British accent, here's Peter with his thoughts on drought tolerance.
Plants need to be tolerant of many things: drought, deer, sudden furious rainstorms, unseasonal temperatures, and if the plants are in Steve's garden, the plants need to tolerate long stretches of neglect, followed by brief flurries of attention at the worst possible time. But I submit that gardeners need to be tolerant of many things as well. We need to tolerate insect damage. If we want a healthy environment, then we need to understand that bugs are a part of that. Only some insects feed on plants, and those insects are food to other insects, birds, toads, and other forms of wildlife. Gardeners also need to be more tolerant of plant flopping. Now, some plants are not supposed to bend over all the other plants near them, but they do that in response to soil that is too rich for them. Other plants are meant to lean their flowers and stems close to the ground to ensure that their seeds or nodes from which they might root can help the plant propagate itself. And perhaps the most important thing gardeners should tolerate is themselves. Let's face it, plants languish or even die. Imagined designs can fail. Maintenance can cause a mishap. None of these mean you're a bad gardener. They mean you are human. The only thing you should not tolerate is the thought that you can't do this. I mean, if Steve can, anyone can.
Well, anybody who spends any time with me has to experience untold levels of tolerance.
Including our expert. Let's see what she has to say on the topic of drought tolerance.
Hi, this is Leslie Harris. I live in Charlottesville and I have a gardening business called LH Gardens. I also do a podcast called Into the Garden with Leslie, which can be found on my website, lhgardens.com, or Apple or Spotify or wherever. And I am on Instagram, Leslie Harris LH. I have 4 drought-resistant plants for you, and I could just list them, but then that would be kind of dull. So I'm actually going to do what Danielle and Steve do and try to make it so that you want to go out and get them immediately in your garden like yesterday. So here we go. The first one that I want to talk about is actually not native to the United States, except there's a type of it that is, and it's the lantana. So this is the Lantana camara, which is the kind I use as one of my favorite annuals here in Charlottesville. When we go to clients' gardens and we think, okay, these clients, they do not water their plants. And actually, they also have deer. That's the one we choose. It's got these tiny little tubular flowers that are either white or whitish yellow or yellowish pink or pinky orange or kind of an orangey red, sometimes purple. I mean, all kinds. And they have those ones that are just by the end of the summer going to be like a 2x2 half circle ball. It almost looks like a shrub because it does actually get quite woody, but it also has the spreading type. This plant is hardy in zones 10 and 11. And if you live down there, I don't know if you actually want to get this plant because I think it actually cross-pollinates with the native lantana that's down there. And that might not be great for the native lantana. But up here where I live in northern states, you can just use it as an annual. And I don't think there's any invasive threat. Obviously, it likes full-on sun. I love the smell of the foliage. I don't know what it smells like to me, just sort of spicy goodness and also warm because it's always hot and sunny where this plant is. I have a couple of crew members who really dislike the smell of the foliage. But one of my crew members who actually worked in a winery, one of our famous wineries down here in Charlottesville for many years, says that it reminds her of a Sauvignon Blanc on a hot sunny day. So I'm going with that. In front of my house, I have a cute little stone wall. Of course, we didn't put it there. But every year I fill up the holes in the stone wall with drought-resistant flowers. And most years I go with lantana. And if it ever happens that I don't water them enough, and I can usually go for about 2 days without watering them, whereas, say, for comparison, if I were to plant petunias in those holes, they would probably need it twice a day. Anyway, if I ever ignore the lantana that's in those holes, the leaves do curl up and you will know that you have to water them, but they won't die. But you could just put it on yourself that if you let lantana get too dry, you're probably a pretty bad plant parent and you have to live with that. So there's that. All right, let's move on to the next one. It's a perennial from zones 8 to 10, but it's perennial for me and I'm in zone 7A. It's called the Salvia guaranitica, and some people call it the Salvia black and blue. For me, it gets to about 4 feet tall. I also love the smell of the foliage of this one. It's like citrusy, lemony, fruity goodness. I don't know. And this is the plant that attracts more hummers to my yard, I think, than any other. It does break dormancy kind of late, so it leaves me sort of a hole beside some peonies and a container that I have right outside my window. I'm like, come on, Salvia guaranitica, let's go here. And then it always does. And then the next thing you know, it's like back to 4 feet tall, like it is all summer. And it blooms all summer. It starts blooming for me in the beginning to middle of June, and it goes until frost. And one of my favorite jobs is to cut it back to get more blooms because of the smell of that wonderful foliage. It will bloom really well in sun, but it will bloom in shade. Where I have it outside my window, probably only gets about 4 to 5 hours of sun, and it blooms plenty. So that's a good one, the Salvia guaranitica or the Salvia black and blue. All right, moving on to the next one. This is one that I do not grow in my garden, but I want to. So I'm with you people who are listening to this and say, I need this plant. I need it yesterday. This is the common milkweed. But please ignore the words common and weed, because they do not bring on for you this glorious sense of a beautiful plant that you need to have. And yet you do need to have this plant, and it is gloriously beautiful. It is native to the eastern United States. Once you get it established, it will need no care from you. It grows to 2 or 3 feet tall. It has pink, mauve, or white blooms. Now, keep in mind, there are lots of different kinds of milkweed or butterfly weed, as some people call it, Asclepias. And some of them, like the swamp one, do need wet feet, but this one does not. So this is, again, the Asclepias. Well, let's have my favorite man from the Missouri Botanical Garden pronounce exact. I love to listen to this guy's voice because he sounds so into his job. Ready?
Asclepias syriaca.
Asclepias syriaca. That's the one you want for your dry area. And it can also be very poor soil. It does need sun, however. This plant is also fragrant. And of course, really the reason you want to grow it is because of monarch butterflies. This plant is the food source for monarch butterfly caterpillars. And what more fun than to watch those things like crawling around, nibbling on your plant, and then they make these beautiful little jewel-like green chrysali, little things where they're going to sleep until they emerge later as butterflies. And that is just a magical thing to watch. If you have children or grandchildren who come to your garden, make sure you get these plants and make sure you watch that show. It's a really good one. So our last plant that I'm going to talk about is the witch hazel. I talked about the witch hazel on my podcast several weeks ago, Into the Garden with Leslie. Each week I do a plant of the week on that podcast, and I'm trying to train myself, although I have a very terrible love of plants native to Asia, I'm trying to train myself to go more native to the United States. And just this past week, I dug out, and I got a lot of exercise according to my iPhone watch, I dug out a very large Miscanthus sinensis right by my back stairs, and I plunked in a witch hazel. But not just any witch hazel. I wasn't really interested. I don't know. I'm sorry, but I'm trying to like them. I'm doing my best. But if you listen to that podcast, you'll know that I think I referred to their bloom as, what did I say? Something terrible like, people talk about it as a beautiful bloom, but to me, it's always reminded me sort of as a used Kleenex in a bad windstorm. But we're going to try to not think about that. And we're going to think about how beautiful that bloom is close up and the delicacy of its little petals. And we're going to enjoy this plant. But the reason I'm going to enjoy it even more possibly than a regular witch hazel is because it's a little cultivar called Little Prospect, and it is variegated. I'm a sucker for variegation on leaves. So these are green leaves with yellow outside. That means I'll be able to enjoy it all year long. Many witch hazels bloom in winter, but this one is a fall blooming one. So it'll end with that not dirty tissue thing. It'll end with a beautiful flower that it's going to attract native bees, and then it'll go into dormancy, which my Miscanthus sinensis would have anyway, and it wouldn't have offered any solace to my native bugs that I want to attract. The witch hazel is hardy in zones 3 through 8. And like I said, the species grows about 15 to 20 feet. But this little guy, this little prospect, only gets 6 to 10 feet tall. So if you're interested in something smaller, I think you ought to look into it. Obviously, once it gets established, it doesn't need a lot of water, and the soil can be very average. All right. Besides just listing a couple of more, which I love in my garden, which need no attention from me, such as low-growing sedums, like hens and chicks that I tuck into my stone walls, and of course, the larger sedums, such as Matrona or Autumn Joy, which need nothing from me. I guess my favorite plant is that relatively new Allium millennium. Those things are fantastic. They bloom for about 6 weeks, and they don't need anything from me either. Actually, I pretty much have a garden full of things that don't need much from me because that's the kind of gardener I am. My clients' gardens get a lot of attention, but not so much mine, and that's okay. Thanks for listening, and I hope you go shopping for some wonderful drought-resistant plants.
So those are some great recommendations from Virginia, which again, not known for its drought, but everywhere is known for droughts these days.
This is true. And just given the fact that, Leslie has to pick plants that will do well in gardens from people who maybe aren't the most attentive, I'm going to take to heart her recommendations for plants that can make it through on a lot of neglect and a little bit of water.